Hello everyone, welcome to part 9 of the Diablo 4 Ability Tray tutorial series. Today we're going to take a look at how to trigger the ability using an input action and also set up the initial function of triggering the ability and the cooldown. Let's get into it. First, we're going to start with setting up the input actions. Now, if you're using Unreal Engine 5 point anything above 5, you would actually have the input action set up in the new enhanced input action process. Will no longer be using any of the old action setup through the project settings. So to set up the new input actions, inside of your third person folder, you would have an input folder and you would see an actions folder. Inside of it, you have input actions. We're going to create a new folder just to keep it tidy and call it ability. Okay. Inside of this ability folder, I'm going to right click, go to input, and then select input action. I'm going to name this IA underscore ability 1. That's all you have to do. And then now if I copy this and then if I paste it, it's going to say ability 2 and then paste it again, until you get to ability 6. Now you can click on save all and it'll save all of it. Now go back to the input folder and there is a file called IMC default. You're going to go in here and then click plus on these mappings. And then here you'll see the ability 1. You're going to select it, click mappings again, and select ability 2, and so on. Now you can click on this little arrow and you can open up every single one of these ability, and you need to set up the key for it. You can actually use this drop-down menu to select your key as you would like a gamepad key if you want to set up or anything. For keyboard, I will select this keyboard button, which will make it turn yellow. Then if I press 1 on my numpad, it's going to set that. And I'm going to do the same thing here for 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that's all you have to do to set up your input action. Easy as that. Now we can save it. We don't need that IMC default anymore. Now inside of our third person character, go to our Diablo tray at the bottom. You can actually right click and say IA underscore ability, and you have your IA ability 1 through 6. I'm going to call the ability 1 and then I'm going to call all the other abilities here. So now we have all of the abilities. Now what we want to do is when the player selects ability 1 or presses keybind number 1, we want to go and take a look at what's in our row, in our ability tray, and select the first ability, which is the one on the far right, and we want to trigger it. And we don't really have a trigger function like to see what happens to the ability when it gets triggered. So let's go and create that one first before we go ahead and actually trigger it. So in our ability icon is where all of our ability and all our ability specific details from the data table is sitting in. So at the very bottom, we can create a custom function, add a custom event, and then call it trigger ability. Now this trigger ability is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to actually, for the purpose of this test, I'm going to get this S ability info, and I'm going to break the S ability info, and I'm going to say when this event gets triggered, I just want you to print a text. And the text is basically the name of the ability. We're pretending like the ability is triggering. And once it is done, because we have already done with our cooldown function, we are going to go ahead and say init cooldown init or cooldown initialize. So this will trigger the cooldown function as well. We're going to use this trigger ability to spawn the effects and sound later, but for now, this would do. Go back to your third person character, and what we want to do is we want to all of these abilities are going to do the exact same thing. They're all going to go in here and trigger the ability. So we don't want to create a separate function for every single one of them. We're going to create one function and we're going to make it work for every one of these abilities. So go to your function tree and create a new function and name it trigger ability. And trigger ability, we need to get a reference to this ability icon, specifically the one with the specific information. And we do that by using the player HUD. This is where we're actually creating the ability of ability icon. So we want to get this child container reference because every time an ability gets created, we're adding it to the child container. So we're going to go to our function. We're going to get a reference to our player HUD, and then we're going to say get child container. And this would actually go get the child container from the player HUD, this one right here. And then from here, we want to say get. Now this get is going to go through this container and take a look at what's in the container, and it's going to get the first one. If the get is 0, if the index is 0, it's going to get the first one. If the index is 1, it's going to get the second one. We're going to take this to our advantage, and in our trigger ability, we're going to select the function and going to put in an input and make that index, index, make that index into the variable. So now if I select it, whatever function is calling this trigger ability, it's going to call that specific index. And once we get that specific index of the child, we're going to go and say trigger ability. And in our Diablo 4 tray, we can now call this trigger ability. And we're going to actually go off of started, not triggered. And we're going to set our index to 0 because the first ability using ability key number 1 is going to trigger ability number 0. And if I were to copy and paste this and then name this into index 1, then it's going to call our second ability. And we can do the same for the rest of them. We're going to set up the index properly. First one is 0, second one is going to be 1, and third one is going to be 2, and so on. So it'll be 3, 4, and 5. The sixth one, the last one's going to be 5. Okay. A second, we need to base it off of our started, not triggered. Okay. So everything looks good. Now let's go ahead and play it and see what happens. If I press 1 right now, nothing's going to happen. But there is a problem that I want to show you. That's why I'm pressing 1. But let's go ahead and get the ability. And now if I press 1, ta-da, the ability is going to be used. The cooldown is going to trigger. And also, if you notice on the top, the name popped up as well, telling us that this is the correct ability that is triggering. If I pick up a second one, third one, fourth one, then I can go ahead and select all those 3, and then you will notice that they're all functioning and the cooldown is triggering right away. In Diablo, all the abilities are a one-shot abilities. That means when you trigger the ability, they immediately activate, and the cooldown activates at the same time as well. Now, if I stop the game, there's going to be an error waiting for me. There it is. It says it's tried to read the property trigger ability, but it couldn't read anything. The reason why this happens is because we're now in our trigger ability, we're getting a reference to our indexes and we're triggering the ability right away. But when the game starts, we have no ability. And that's why the error is coming up, because if there's no ability, that means it shouldn't have tried to trigger this ability, and it did, and the target is actually not available. So that's why the trigger is available. That's why the error occurred. To fix it, we're going to go ahead and say, actually drag off of this get and say is valid with a question mark. And then now we're going to execute this is valid function and say, hey, is this index of this child, is this valid? If it is valid, only then trigger the ability. If it is not valid, don't trigger the ability. Now if I go in here and then I press the buttons, and if I press escape, there are no more errors. But there's one more problem. If I go pick up the ability and press 1, it's going to work fine. But if I press 1 while it's in cooldown, if I keep pressing 1, it's never going to end. It's going to keep triggering that event. So we want to go and put in some sort of a check to make sure that the cooldown is completed before we can use it again. And we already did that check in our previous tutorial. When we created the ability icon, we also created a function called start cooldown. And we said only when the start cooldown is true, it's going to trigger the cooldown. We originally set up our start cooldown with true. We're going to go ahead and make that into false. We want the cooldown to start as false. That means it's not in cooldown. Then we're going to go back to our third person character. Before we trigger the ability, we want to get this child and see what's the condition of the start cooldown. So we're going to say get start cooldown. And then I'm going to hold B, bravo, and then click to create a branch. Once we identify that this ability is valid, we want to see if it is in cooldown or not. If it is in cooldown, we don't want to trigger the ability. If it is not in cooldown, we want to go ahead and trigger the ability. Just quickly clean this up. Okay. So this should work well. If I go here, I press 1 and 2. If there's any problem, it'll give us an error when we're done. I grab a couple ability, and then now if I press the buttons, if I keep pressing it again, nothing happens. But as soon as the cooldown is done, that ability triggers right away because I'm constantly pressing those buttons, and it's going to trigger right away. And that is how you do the input action for each and every single ability. Now, we're going to further customize this ability function because off of this trigger ability, we can do so much things. We can even say, trigger an effects at that position, play a sound, do some damage, or anything and everything. You can actually use this trigger ability to get that down. We're going to go take a look at that in our next video to see how we're going to create abilities and also be able to trigger and give it some functions. So team, thank you very much for joining me again today with this Diablo 4 tutorial series. And I really do appreciate your time you're here. If this video had helped you in any way, please consider liking this video, as this helps the channel grow and reach more developers just like you who may need the assistance. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next part.